Tonight, or maybe yesterday, or maybe a week ago, someone you know lost someone, and you probably did not know what to do. You showed up, you said something, you felt the awkward weight of standing in a room full of grief, not sure where to put your hands, not sure what words were right. That feeling, that helpless, fumbling, deeply human response to death, is not a flaw. It is one of the oldest things about you. What ancient humans actually did when someone died will change the way you understand yourself. Not because it is strange, because it is not strange at all. The oldest known burial on Earth dates back roughly 300,000 years. It was discovered in a cave system in South Africa called the Rising Star Cave, and the bones found there belong to a creature called Homo naledi, a species with a brain about the size of an orange, smaller than yours, smaller than a chimpanzee's. And yet, deep inside a cave that required crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body, these small-brained hominins appear to have deliberately placed their dead. Anthropologist Lee Berger and his team published their findings in 2023, and the scientific community is still debating what it means. But the question the discovery raises is enormous. If a creature with a fraction of your cognitive capacity was already doing something intentional with its dead, what does that tell you about grief? What does that tell you about the impulse to not just leave a body where it falls? It tells you that caring for the dead is not a product of civilization. It is a product of being alive. Go back further. 230,000 years ago, in what is now northern Spain, researchers working at a site called Atapuerca found something extraordinary inside a vertical cave shaft 30 meters deep. At the bottom of that shaft, they found the bones of at least 28 Homo heidelbergensis individuals, one of our direct ancestors. The shaft had no other function. There were no animals in there, no tools, no food debris, just the dead, deliberately dropped or lowered or placed into the dark. Paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, who has spent decades excavating the site, calls it the Pit of Bones, and he believes it represents the earliest known intentional disposal of the dead with something that might be called symbolic meaning. One single hand axe made from a rare red stone was found among the bones, nothing else like it. It had no practical use down there in the dark. It was an offering. 330,000 years before any religion you know had a name. Your brain is not doing something modern when it needs to mark a death. It is doing something ancient. Something that predates language, predates writing, predates agriculture, predates every institution that has ever tried to give death meaning. The impulse came first. The rituals came after. But what exactly did those rituals look like? When Homo sapiens, your direct species, began leaving clearer archaeological evidence, the picture becomes richer. Roughly 100,000 years ago, at a site called Skull Cave in what is now Israel, researchers found skeletons buried with red ochre smeared across the bones. Red ochre is iron oxide, a mineral that produces a deep blood red pigment. It required effort to find, to grind, to apply. The people buried there were prepared. They were painted. And at the same site, one individual was buried holding the jaw of a wild boar. Another with shells that had been carried from the coast miles away. These were not accidents. These were choices. Archaeologist Francesco D'Erico, who has studied pigment use in early human burials, argues that the use of red ochre was likely tied to symbolic thinking about blood, life, and the body's departure from one state to another. They were narrating death. They were saying, this person mattered. This person belonged somewhere. This person is going somewhere. You still do this. Every flower left on a grave is the same impulse as that boar jaw. Every object placed in a coffin is the same act as those shells. The form changes. The feeling does not. But here is where it gets stranger. At a site in Sungir, Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered two children buried head-to-head in a long grave. They were covered, and this is not a metaphor. covered in mammoth ivory beads. More than 10,000 beads, each one individually carved, each one requiring about an hour of labor to produce. Researcher Randall White, who analyzed the burial, estimated that the beads alone represented more than 10,000 hours of human work for two children. Children who, based on bone analysis, may have had health conditions that meant they could not have contributed to the group's survival in obvious ways. And yet, the group poured its labor, its art, its time into honoring them in death. Think about what that means. These were people living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They were hunting mammoths. They were surviving Ice Age winters. And they stopped. They carved 10,000 beads. They dressed their dead children in the most elaborate clothing that has ever been found from this period of human history. Why? Because the children mattered. Because grief demanded expression. Because the group needed to mark what had been lost. Psychologist Paul Bloom, in his work on human moral development, argues that the impulse to honor the dead is tied to how humans treat one another while alive. Groups that cared for their dead were likely groups that cared for their sick, their young, their injured. The burial was not separate from the social contract, it was part of it. Your discomfort at a funeral, your urge to bring food, to hug someone, to say the wrong thing and mean it anyway. That is 34,000 years of social instinct firing in your nervous system. Now consider what happened in ancient Egypt, or ancient Greece, or among the Norse, or the Zoroastrians who left their dead on sky platforms for vultures to consume, or the Tibetan sky burial tradition that continues today, or the elaborate jazz funerals of New Orleans, or the Torajan people of Sulawesi in Indonesia, who keep their dead in the family home for months, sometimes years, treating the body as sleeping rather than gone, talking to it, feeding it, caring for it until the family is financially ready to hold the funeral ceremony. Every culture, everywhere, in every era, has done something. Not one human society has ever been found that simply abandoned its dead without ritual. Not one. Anthropologist Barbara King, in her book Evolving God, makes the case that the emotional lives of our ancestors were more complex and more recognizable than we tend to assume. Grief, she argues, is not a modern invention overlaid onto a coldly practical species. It is what the species runs on, connection and its loss. That is the engine of everything. And here is the part that changes how you understand yourself today. When someone dies and you do not know what to do, when you bring a casserole because words feel impossible, when you attend a service even though you are not sure you believe in anything it represents, when you find yourself keeping an object that belonged to someone who is gone, something small and ordinary like a mug or a worn pair of gloves, you are not performing a social obligation. You are doing what your species has always done. You are reaching toward the same thing those people at Sunghir reached toward when they carved 10,000 beads in the dark of an Ice Age winter. You are saying, this person was here. This person was real. The fact that they are gone does not unmake what they were. The specific symbols change. The specific God or absence of God changes, but the reach does not change. And maybe that is what is most important to understand about grief. You have never been taught how to do it because it does not need to be taught. Your brain already knows. It learned 30,000 years before you were born. It learned in a pit of bones in Spain, in a cave smeared with red ochre in Israel, in a field in Russia, where someone carved a bead for 10 hours in the middle of winter because a child deserved to be remembered. Tonight, or maybe yesterday, or maybe a week ago, someone you know lost someone, and you showed up. You did not know what to say. You said something anyway, that helpless, fumbling, deeply human thing you did. Your ancestors would have recognized it immediately, because they were doing it too. For as long as there have been humans, there has been someone standing in the presence of loss, not knowing what to do, and doing something anyway. That is not weakness. That is the oldest thing you carry.